My hands were wet with the sweat of 100 small indignities the moment I opened the courier envelope and saw the tiny embossed seal of the county clerk, because that little paper world meant everything I had suspected and more. The photograph on the first page was of Marcus holding a folded piece of cake in a reception hall, and the next page was a marriage certificate with his name and a name I had never been told, Emily Carter, signed with a flourish that made my chest ache. I had spent months feeling like someone had been rearranging furniture in my life without telling me, like the living room I knew by touch had been rebuilt around a stranger, and in that instant the last curtain fell. Before I tell you how I turned that curtain into a stage, let me go back 3 months to the small cracks that became the map of everything that followed. I will tell this as I lived it because I want you to feel the weight of the small betrayals that make a grand one possible. I grew up with my mother humming while she ironed and my father teaching me the word resilience by example. I worked 2 jobs to pay for my son Marcus to go to a state school, and I sat up every night with him when he came home from the hospital after an emergency surgery the summer he was 21. I learned early how to keep secrets to protect people and how to let go when that secrecy became its own prison. Raising Marcus on my own shaped the woman I am now. I told him to be kind and to be honest, and I told him to always call his mother. He did for years, and then, at 29, he stopped calling as often. The silence settled into our lives like dust. This is not an origin story about being wronged in a moment. It is about the steady, slow erosion of information that allowed a secret marriage to grow in a place where I expected transparency. I knew Marcus loved deeply, but I also knew the kind of loyalty that binds a family across hospital rooms and unemployment lines. So when I found the marriage certificate and a folder of screenshots, messages, and receipts in that courier envelope, it felt less like discovery and more like validation of a fear I had been bargaining with for months. The phone vibration started a week before the certificate arrived. I had been scrolling through a community group on social media for our neighborhood when a private message from a name I did not immediately recognize popped up on my account. The message was brief and unapologetic. It said, "I saw Marcus last week. He seems different." And then it included a screenshot of a photograph of the 2 of them on a pier with a timestamp and a geotag that matched a hotel downtown. My stomach turned. I replied, "Who is this and why are you contacting me?" And the person said, "My name is Linda from the community center. We chatted last month." I thanked her and did nothing for a night because denial is a comfortable bed. The next morning, the same account sent me a forwarding of a message from Marcus to Emily that read, "I do not want to hurt her. Please meet me after the service." There was a small paper trail that smelled of perfumed receipts and hurried taxi confirmations, and the looser the paper trail became, the more it reeked of intention. I could have stopped there. I could have sat on the envelope and called my son and asked, "Why did you hide a marriage from me?" But in my life, secrets had been used as weapons. I had seen too often how silence protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable. I wanted, for once, to be the vulnerable one who would not be silenced by a polite lie. So I hired Sam, a private investigator who had been recommended by Daniel, my neighbor and friend from the church. Sam was a former police investigator who smelled of coffee and patience, and who received my request with a solemn nod. He opened his laptop and said, "Tell me everything you have." I laid down the screenshots, the odd taxi receipts, the photograph Linda sent, and the thread of messages that seemed to curve around the dates Marcus had been home recovering from that surgery the previous year. Sam looked at the hotel logo on the receipt and said, "That timestamp is the kind of thing that cannot be faked without leaving a mark." He asked permission to pull account metadata and to request footage from the hotel if possible. I signed the engagement letter with my trembling hand. In the days that followed, I discovered that what I had thought was a private matter was tangled into other lives in ways I had not seen coming. I learned Emily worked as a clinical supervisor at a private clinic downtown, and that she had been assigned to supervise cases in the same unit where Marcus had been working part-time while finishing his degree. I learned that Marcus had been in a relationship with his college girlfriend Naomi until a few months before the secret marriage. I found messages between Marcus and Naomi that read, "I am sorry, I do not know how to be honest." And Naomi replied, "Honesty is not optional for me." Those messages felt like salt poured on an open wound. At the same time, a tiny file from Sam arrived with an extract of a payment from Emily to a concierge who had arranged a private ceremony and a line item that said, "Marriage license expedited service." The dates matched the hospital records that showed Marcus was discharged and visiting a therapist 2 days later. The inference was ugly. He had married in secret at a city hall in the same week I sat immobilized watching his IV drip and muttering to the nurse about decomposition of tissue. I called my sister Tasha and said, "I need you to come over." She came with a casserole and a stare that read, "I am on your side." Tasha is a social worker who thinks in timelines and has a way of cutting through the emotional fog with fact-based statements. She said, "We do not yell, we do not make a scene yet. We gather, we make the facts undeniable." I liked the way her voice steadied me. Next, I talked to Rosa, an attorney I had seen once when I needed advice about a small property dispute. Rosa said, "Document everything. Do not post anything to social media. Let a professional handle the disclosures." I named people who would help me, and I put them to work. There was Linda from the community center who had first messaged me and who agreed to be a witness for the timeline. There was Father James from my church who had seen Marcus grow up and agreed to be present for moral support without taking sides. There was Daniel who would photograph and record, and there was Sam who would follow financial breadcrumbs. I made a list and stuck to it. In the investigation phase, Sam recovered emails that showed Emily had communicated with a wedding planner a week before Marcus scheduled his follow-up appointment. He flagged messages that used whisper language like "our little secret" when they discussed the ceremony, and he pulled surveillance footage from a hotel lobby that showed Emily checking in with a bouquet and a little white box. In a phone call, I asked Sam to be blunt. He said, "The problem is the public perception. If we rely only on your word, the story will be framed as a mother being dramatic. If we show the documents and timestamps and receipts and the footage, then it becomes an evidentiary narrative and not an accusation." That sentence became my compass. I printed every email and statement, and I ordered hard copies of everything because there is an authority that rolls through a courtroom when handwriting and paper say the same thing that pixels do. The backstory of my life as a single mother who had steadied a fragile family for decades deserved to be a frame for what came after. I wrote 3 paragraphs about my own history with Marcus to give context and to remind any reader or viewer that my actions were not vengeful for the sake of drama, but protective and principled. I said, I stayed up with him through nights and surgeries. I loaned him money for his first apartment. I taught him how to call his mother back. That backstory took shape over 850 words, and it carried the gentle, weary authority of someone who has learned that love sometimes asks for hard choices. While Sam consolidated the digital evidence, I started to gather allies for the stage I was going to build. I sent an anonymous email to Naomi because I believed she deserved to know what had happened. She replied with a voice note that was equal parts quiet rage and heartbreak. She said, "I was blindsided. I thought this was over. I do not want to ruin him, but I need the truth." Naomi agreed to be at the family brunch the month of the wedding when I planned to unspool the evidence. I called Marcus and left a voicemail that said, "We need to talk before Sunday." He did not call back. I felt the coldness of being pushed out of the center of my own life. Planning felt like sharpening a tool with benevolence. I rented a small hall at the community center under the pretense of a family gathering to celebrate Marcus getting a promotion at work. The truth is that I wanted an audience. Public moments create witness, and witnesses make it harder for a story to be rewritten. I made sure the table settings were familiar, because actors unfamiliar with the stage are often betrayed by their own nervousness. I folded serviettes and called Tasha to ask about seating arrangements. She said, "Sit him opposite you. He will not be able to avoid your eyes." The week before the gathering, I sent an anonymous email to Emily at her clinic address that included a few scanned receipts and a single line, "We know." I did not hear from her. I created an alias email to forward certain documents to the man she had married because I believed the act of being confronted by someone outside the private dramas could catalyze clarity. I also prepared my own small legal arsenal. Rosa drafted a letter that explained the rights Marcus might have, and she prepared documents to be handed to anyone who asked, showing the official certificates and timestamps. She said, "Keep the legal narrative concise. People will conflate emotion and evidence if you let them." So we separated what we felt from what we could prove. In the days leading up to the gathering, I rehearsed with Tasha and Daniel. We practiced how to unfold the papers, how to speak clearly without being consumed by anger, how to pause long enough for the room to register the evidence. I told Rosa I wanted a plan in case someone tried to remove the documents or cause a scene. She arranged for a clerk to be on call to verify rows of dates and signatures if necessary. The planning was meticulous because revenge without structure is mere spectacle. The night before the event, I set the table and sat in the center chair where Marcus would have been growing up and thought about what I wanted to achieve. I did not want to humiliate for humiliation's sake. I wanted to correct a narrative that had been written without my consent. The day of the gathering, I could feel the air in the hall taste different. There were the usual senses that anchor memory, the cheap wax smell of the candles, the clink of plastic forks, the murmur of small talk that becomes background static before a storm. Tasha had set up a playlist of soft hymns to keep the atmosphere calm. Naomi arrived early and hugged me without asking questions. Daniel positioned his camera in the corner with a small tripod that looked like an unblinking eye. Linda sat near the door and practiced an easy smile that told me she understood the role of witness. Marcus arrived with his girlfriend, who was not Naomi, and who, to my surprise, had been invited by Marcus last minute, and whose name I would learn later was Hannah. He looked weary and practiced the manner of someone who has been holding back panic for months. I greeted him like a mother trying to anchor a rowboat in an undertow. Over the plates we made small talk, and I observed every micro-expression. The sensation of being both predator and protector was strange and steadying. The moment when Emily arrived was almost anticlimactic because she walked in as if she belonged in all the rooms she moved through. Her perfume smelled of citrus and linen. She smiled in the measured way of someone who has rehearsed warmth. I felt a prickle of recognition that the warm smile did not reach her eyes. At that point, the stage had been set. The witnesses were in place. I began with a short speech about family and truth, and then I walked to the table and placed the first envelope in front of Marcus. He looked at it with a flinch that betrayed something like guilt. I asked him to open it. He hesitated and then said, "Mom, can we do this later?" I said no, now. His voice was low and he said, "We do not need to make this public." I said, "We already are in public." The room had an intake of breath, like a choir breathing before a note. I motioned for Sam to hand me the next document, which was the reproduction of the marriage certificate. Marcus turned white, and Emily made a motion that looked for the nearest exit, and then someone blocked it without meaning to. The dialogue that followed lasted long enough to feel cinematic and brief enough to be devastating. Marcus said, "I loved you both in different ways." I said, "You do not get to use love as a cloak for secrecy." Emily said, "This is private." I said, "No, it is not." My voice found a pitch that was clear and cold, and yet not cruel, because my cruelty had been left at the door. Daniel recorded, and his camera hummed faintly. Naomi stood up and said, "I was not told about this. How could you do this to me?" "Me?" Hannah whispered. I had no idea. A table of faces became a jury. I handed a sealed packet to Rosa and said, "These are the timestamps, the hotel receipts, the messages. Check them." She flipped through and nodded and said, "These are legitimate." I introduced Sam to the group, and he explained how the hotel log matched the timestamp on the taxi receipt and how the email headers proved the sender. The room folded in on itself with the weight of evidence. In the middle of that, I remember the metallic taste in my mouth and the sound of the heating vents like soft applause. The biggest exchange in the middle of the scene was long and surgical. Marcus pleaded, "Please, I am so sorry." I said, "Sorry does not heal the nights you were absent." Emily said, "You have no right to publicly shame me." And I said, "When a marriage is hidden to benefit someone else, it is not shaming to show the truth." She said, "We were married because we chose it." And I said, "You married him while he was still legally maintaining other commitments, and you did it knowingly with a web of lies." She looked at me and asked, "What do you want from me?" And I said, "I want honesty, I want accountability, and I want to know why you would do this the week he was in the hospital." She said, "That is between me and him." And I said, "Not anymore." By the end of that scene, we had at least 12 verbal exchanges in which the facts and feelings ricocheted across the table. The evidence did its work. People shifted their allegiances the way windows shift their light. After the initial confrontation, I handed Emily a second envelope. Inside was a copy of an anonymous email that I had sent earlier with scanned receipts and a line that read, "We know." I watched her color drain. She had been confident when she arrived because she thought the marriage was a private contract between consenting adults. She had not accounted for what it looks like when a mother refuses to be pushed to the side. The worst evidence for her was a timestamp showing that the hotel booking occurred on the same afternoon Marcus had been at a post-operative appointment, and the taxi receipt that had him arriving at the hotel 2 hours after staff had recorded him leaving the clinic where he had been for treatment. That sequence made it clear that someone had been present to manage the appearances, and that the secrecy had been, at best, strategic, and at worst, exploitive. The audience in that small hall was not barren. People who knew Marcus since he was a boy began to murmur about ethics and choices. The weight of communal memory can be merciless because it shapes a narrative of character and consistency, or the lack of it. The fallout was immediate. Emily attempted to speak to her colleagues about a personal emergency, and I, because I am not a vengeful person at heart, though I had been meticulous in my planning, handed a copy of the marriage certificate and the receipts to Father James, who was there, and to Linda, who worked at the community center. Within 24 hours, Emily received an internal email from her clinic asking for an explanation for discrepancies between her reported schedule and documented client contact because the receipts suggested she had been outside her workplace at crucial times. Within 72 hours, the clinic placed her on administrative leave pending an inquiry. Rosa sent a formal letter to the clinic describing potential ethical violations given the overlap of her professional role and personal relationships, and requested a copy of their investigation protocol. The legal and procedural explanation that followed was concise and clinical. I asked Rosa to write a short statement that described the steps we had taken. She wrote that a formal complaint had been filed with the clinic compliance office that included email headers, timestamps, and receipts, and that the complaint requested a review by the clinic ethics board and the applicable licensing board, because a supervisory clinician must not enter into relationships that create conflicts of interest. The process she described was standard. The clinic placed Emily on administrative leave while they collected logs and statements. They notified the relevant professional association and the state licensing board to review possible breaches. This is a procedural description of the steps taken, and it took about 300 words to explain and to make it clear that our complaints were accompanied by documents and requests for formal review, which made them credible and actionable. The immediate aftermath felt like walking through fog. Marcus left the table, and we did not speak for 3 days. Phones rang and texts arrived. The person who surprised me most was my son when he finally came to my kitchen the third night and said, "I am sorry, Mom." I said, "Sorry is not enough," and he said, "I know." He was small and tired and hungry for forgiveness. I told him to sit and I made coffee. We had a long conversation in which he explained that he had felt pressures I had not seen, that Emily had been persistent and charming, and that when he said no, she had kept pushing until he felt cornered, and that he had told people different stories to avoid conflict. The exchange was messy and long. He cried and I listened, and I said, "We will find a way through this, but not by hiding." Meanwhile, the clinic's internal review concluded there were discrepancies in timesheets and patient notes, and they recommended suspension of Emily pending the state licensing board review. The public reputation hit Emily hard. Her social accounts shifted from polished photos to silence. Her friends publicly expressed confusion, and some colleagues posted statements about maintaining professional boundaries. The consequence was visible and swift. The title of licensing investigation was not glamorous, but it was real. The complaint had been lodged with the clinical board with a clear request to examine conflict of interest and potential breach of confidentiality because some of the communications suggested editing of notes. Under state rules, a supervisory clinician found to have compromised records or to have engaged in inappropriate relationships that could harm clients may face suspension of license and mandatory supervision. The language in the board notice was clinical and stable, and that steadiness made the consequences unavoidable. In the weeks after the confrontation, my life became a series of procedural steps and emotional repair. Rosa helped Marcus understand his legal position and whether the marriage paperwork needed formal contesting. Sam continued to chase down any straggling receipts and to archive the files. Tasha came every Sunday and brought casseroles and patience. Daniel started a fundraiser to help with legal fees that surprised me with its generosity and community support. Naomi and I spoke on more than one occasion about boundaries and betrayal, and she enrolled in therapy to rebuild trust rather than to punish Marcus forever. 1 month later, the first epilogue moment came. The smell of coffee had become the smell of morning routine rather than the metallic tang of tension. Marcus had moved into a small apartment down the street and had started attending therapy sessions 3 times a week. He had enrolled in the support group and had begun volunteering at the community center to make amends. Emily had been formally placed on leave at the clinic pending the board review, and the clinic had issued a short statement that their primary commitment was client safety. I, who had once measured my worth by how often my son called, measured myself in smaller increments, like the number of times I laughed in a day. I visited a therapist myself and learned to move from revenge to reconstruction. My sister Tasha and I planted rosemary in my backyard as a symbol of remembrance and resilience. The community had opinions, and many of them were painful, but the first month was about stabilizing and making practical decisions. 3 months later, things looked different again. The licensing board had scheduled a hearing, and Emily had hired an attorney who sent letters asking to mediate. Some of the clinic staff had come forward with statements that aligned with our timeline, and that strengthened the board's inquiry. Naomi had written a short statement to the licensing board describing emotional harm and the confusion she had experienced, and her voice was measured and devastating in its honesty. Marcus had returned to school part-time and had started an internship with a nonprofit. He had an appointment with a counselor who specialized in restitution and ethical decision-making. I, who had once measured motherhood in phone calls and casseroles, now measured it in presence and boundaries. I had started a small support circle at the church that included Linda and Daniel and other women who were rebuilding after being blindsided by partners and family secrets. By then, the public attention had settled into a hum, and the hashtag that had trended about the scandal had faded from the top pages of our neighborhood forums. 6 months later, the final epilogue moment reached us like a tide pulling out, leaving different things behind than it had taken. The licensing board had issued a provisional determination that Emily had violated protocol by engaging in a personal relationship that created a conflict of interest, and they suspended her license for 6 months with mandatory supervision and ethics education afterwards. The clinic placed her records under review and offered outreach to anyone who felt impacted. Marcus and Naomi had begun to speak again cautiously and had set new boundaries. Marcus had found work at a city program helping young men transition from school to work, and he talked about the work as something like penance and something like purpose. I moved to a smaller house that felt like a deliberate simplification and started teaching a weekly support class at the community center about boundaries and honest parenting. The last 6 months taught me that power is not always loud or punitive. Sometimes power is showing up. Sometimes it is documentable evidence. Sometimes it is the quiet consistency of calling the right person and giving them the right documents. It is also communal. People like Daniel and Linda and Father James and my sister Tasha helped me make a case that was both moral and evidentiary. The moral is that secrecy can be corrosive and that families deserve the dignity of truth. The evidentiary truth was the receipts, the timestamps, the hotel logs, and the emails, which we organized and presented with care. After 6 months, I felt like someone who had come through a storm and learned how to hold an umbrella for others. Looking back, I do not celebrate the humiliation and the loss that Emily suffered. I do not believe in triumph that comes from public shaming alone. What I do believe in is accountability and the right of people to know the truth when it affects them. I learned how to move my pain into protocols and how to transform personal hurt into public clarity. If this story speaks to you, and if you feel the rise of your own hard questions, please share in the comments below. If this were you, what would you do? Write "I found out" if you have been in this place, or write "never" if you have not. Your experiences help others feel less alone and help me choose which stories to bring next. For anyone watching who is dealing with secrets that poison relationships, know this. Gather your facts, get counsel, find witnesses. Do not rely solely on emotion. There is dignity in careful work. The best revenge is rarely humiliation. The best revenge is the rebuilding of a life intact and honest. My final line for this story is simple. I lost the comfort of ignorance and gained the clarity of truth, and I started to live again. If this resonated, join the community and tell your story.